Hey everybody, MS Farzan here, and in this video we're going to talk about working with different player types. Rogue Enterprise has asked a great question. How do we deal with problem players, and what kind of content can we serve up for our players depending on the group? There are a lot of good answers to these types of questions, and I'm first going to point you to Robin D. Law's Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering, which is kind of the gold standard if you're thinking about player types. I'll link it in the description below this video. And you'll also want to check out Matt Colville's video on different kinds of players, which I'll also link below this video. But for our purposes today, I'd like you to think outside of the box a little bit and outside of general player types, and think even more generally and think, what are ways that I can engage players at my table and deliver good content irrespective of what I think they are. If I think that they're all rules lawyers, or I think that I have one power gamer and one role player at my table. How can I engage anyone who comes to my table and be a good game master for them, or as best as I can be, given that player types are spectrums, that you might be a little bit of a rules lawyer, or maybe a power gamer, or maybe you're a tactician, or maybe you're all of them at the same time. How do I invite you to be part of my table and really engage you as a player so that everybody has fun? The first thing I want you to think about is what I call player agency, or the no but rule. Player agency simply means you want your players to feel like they are invested in what's happening at all points in time in your adventure or your campaign, and you want them to feel that whatever happens to them in the campaign is because of something that they did. You never want your players to feel like there's this Deus Ex Machina that is essentially swooping in at the last minute and making something happen to their party or their group that has no basis in what's happened so far. You never want a player to feel like they don't have agency in the things that they're doing, and that's why I call it the no but rule. This is what that means. If a player is trying to do something that is way outside of the scope of what you have planned for the campaign, or is simply not even part of the mechanics of the rules, the easiest and the most reactive way to respond is just to say, no, you can't do that. So if you set up this whole scenario where the players are at the Duke's ball, the Duke and the Duchess have put on this huge masquerade, and there's supposed to be a lot of political intrigue and a lot of discussions between NPCs, and the first thing the players do is say that, okay, I'm going to go assassinate the Duke. That may throw a wrench in your plans for the entire event, and it's much easier to just say, no, you can't do that. The Duke is standing on a pedestal and you can't reach him. And then your players say, okay, well, I'm going to take out my short bow and I'm going to fling arrows at them. And then you start playing this negotiation process with the players where you're squirming around the main point, which is that you don't want them to take out the Duke, that the Duke plays a pivotal role in some conversation that's supposed to happen 3 or 4 combat encounters from now. So the easiest thing to say is just no. But instead of saying that, I'd encourage you to say no but, meaning give them a way to feel like they have agency in what's happening, by giving them an option that may seem different from what they originally intended. So you could say, no, you can't hit the Duke from where you are because there's just too many people in between and you're going to draw attention to yourself. But you can attempt to sneak around over the course of this encounter or this game session and make your way through the crowd and position yourself so that when the time is right, you'll be able to assassinate the Duke or attempt to assassinate the Duke. This gives players a bit of agency in feeling that they are committed to what's happening and that they are actors in what's happening in your game session, rather than just being passive observers of what you want to happen. Putting the action into players' hands is one of a great ways to get them involved, irrespective of what kind of player type they are. I'll talk about this more in just a second. But first I want you to think about the second rule, which is called player consequences, or what I like to call the yes and rule. A lot of times, players in sessions will try to do things similar to what we just discussed without really thinking about the consequences of their actions. And this could, again, throw a monkey wrench in your plans for the group. If we take the Duke's soiree or the Duke's masquerade as an example again, if you have this idea that you want to do all of this political intrigue and NPC discussions and talking with different people and have this social interaction based encounter. Whether or not that's the right thing for this group, well, that's a different question. But if you're finding that the players are either not engaging with that encounter or that they're trying to do things that are completely outside of the scope of what you had planned for that encounter, there's no problem with that. Just say yes, but also say and. When you say yes and, that means yes, you can do whatever it is that you were planning to do, and here are the consequences of doing so. For example, if the players enter the soiree and immediately start thinking tactically about how they could enhance their abilities in case combat arises, and they ask you about different spells that they could cast, or probably they'll just tell you, you could say yes, you can absolutely cast Bless on yourself or any number of spells that you want to do in case you're able to get up to the Duke in a couple of rounds and assassinate him. And everybody's going to start looking at you funny because it's kind of a weird scenario for you to just enter a public space and then start casting spells all over yourselves. Or you could say, yes, you can do that, and you'll have to make a sleight of hand check to hide the fact that you're casting a spell on yourself while the herald is still introducing you. That's a much more interesting way than saying, no, you can't cast spells right now because everybody's looking at you. Allow them to see their own consequences, the own consequences of their actions, and you'll be much better suited to present an engaging story and present content that they might be more engaged with than they would be otherwise if you're just saying, no, you can't do this, or this is the way that I want you to play. Thinking of these two things, player agency and player consequences, or the no but rule and the yes and rule, we can look at Robin Law's player types and kind of tease out how that works a little bit with different types of players. So if we think about Robin Law's butt kicker, for example, this is someone who is a combat aficionado and someone who just wants to jump into combat and break stuff. We all need those kind of players in our parties and in our groups. But sometimes that can be a bit disconcerting if you're trying to enact a social scenario or do some role playing, or if there are other people in the party who are more interested in negotiating with non-player characters, and you just have this one player who just wants to take an axe to whatever it is and fix everything with a hammer instead of a screwdriver. One way of handling this is to use the concept of player consequences. So if the person wants to engage in combat instead of working with someone else, in fact, I had this happen recently, you can just say, yes, you can do this, and here are the consequences of doing so. So you may have reached a critical point in a campaign where they're talking with a group of NPCs, and there is the possibility to negotiate peacefully, and this person, your butt kicker, just wants to create combat out of it. You can absolutely let that happen and let them know that if they engage with combat, these are the consequences of doing so. Or perhaps that if they do so, they're going to be looked upon by the rest of the group or the rest of the town as more on the side of neutral evil or chaotic evil than on neutral good or true neutral, and saying that their alignment might change in some fashion, at least temporarily, because they're committing what will be perceived as a violent act in this group of villagers or amongst their own party members. That gives a little bit more texture than just saying, no, you can't do combat here because we're trying to engage in negotiation, or the rest of the party is engaging in negotiation. And gives the player some idea of consequences to their actions while you're saying yes and. On the other hand, you might have a tactician in your party who is always trying to do what is tactically best for themselves or for the party at large. There's nothing wrong with this. Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games are at their essence games, so there's nothing wrong with trying to be better at that game. Sometimes this could result in a player's turn taking 5 or 6 minutes for them to decide what they want to do and how to be most tactical about things, and using their strategic resources and talking to different people. There's nothing wrong with that. You could say, yes to all of that and say this is a great idea, and everyone around you hears you as you're, in terms of the non-player characters, all of them hear you while you're talking out loud and telling everybody what you're going to do the next round, and then there are consequences for those actions. This is kind of a fun way of handling it, especially if your players are used to talking amongst themselves and trying to create the best tactically viable scenario for themselves. You could just have the non-player characters start responding to them as they're talking. So when one of them says, all right, I'm going to flank this monster and I'm going to backstab them after you cast magic missile, you could absolutely, as the monsters, say, you don't flank me, I'm going to flank you, and my monster friend is also going to cast magic missile because they know magic, or something like that. I don't know, make it up on the spot. The point is that you can engage players based on the consequences of their actions and say yes, and this is what's going to happen if you continue to do your tactical analysis while you're saying it out loud. On the other hand, you might have a storyteller in your party that is really interested in the role-playing aspect of it, and sometimes to an extreme that might not mesh with other players in your group. This could be, in a sense, like when other players are engaged in combat and they always want to, or most of the time want to role-play what's happening and engage in negotiation or persuasion, or use their role-playing skills to their advantage within combat. Once again, it's very easy to say, no, you just roll the dice and that's what's going to happen. But I had a situation kind of recently where one of my players was really engaged in the role-playing aspect of their character, and was almost bargaining at different stages, whether in combat or outside of combat, to use their role-playing for some sort of mechanical advantage. I think this is actually a really cool idea, and I think it actually behooves you to say to your players that you can have agency in what you're doing, and you can say you can do certain things, but I'm going to provide a limit to what exactly you're doing without saying no, so that you feel that you have agency in the entire process. So in this particular case, they were trying to use a cantrip to affect something that was happening in combat on a larger scale than what the rules provide for. So I said yes, and I provided a difficulty class for an Arcana check that they had to use for there to be a specific effect on combat. For example, I said if they were able to make this Arcana check in this particular situation, then their opponents, the monsters, would get disadvantage on their combat roll. In effect, this person was saying, I want to do this role-playing thing, I want to do this storytelling thing, and I want it to affect the combat mechanics, which, by and large, shouldn't really work, because the combat mechanics are there for a reason, they're balanced for a reason, and adhering to them to some degree, I think, helps move combat forward in a natural and balanced fashion. But I want to empower this player and encourage them to have agency in what's happening. So I said, okay, make this roll. If you make this Arcana roll, you are going to force the monsters to take disadvantage on their next combat roll. So the player rolls the Arcana check and gets a 1, and the table just is in uproar and thinks it's the funniest thing and the most amazing thing that's happened in the session so far. And it turns out that the monsters got advantage on their roll, on their combat rolls, for the next 1d4 rounds. Turns out it was for 4 rounds. So it kind of turned ugly, but it turned out way more fun than me just saying, no, you can't do that. That's not how that cantrip is used. So when you say no, but you're putting agency into the player's hands and encouraging them to do what they want to do, but still within the limits of what you're trying to do for your campaign. Similarly, you might have a power gamer or a rules lawyer, someone who's really interested in min-maxing their character and playing by the rules, and these two things obviously could be separate, but for the sake of argument, let's say this person is really challenging you on rules, making calculations in the background and saying that, oh, well, such and such monster shouldn't have this high of an AC, or it doesn't make sense that they were able to ambush us this round because we made this perception check, and really taking the fun out of some of the gaming that you're trying to attempt, because they are playing by the rules and trying to power game. Well, one way to give them agency and to say no but to them is to give them something to do that makes them feel empowered and feel like they have agency in the campaign at large. At the end of the day, a player wants to feel like they have agency in what's happening to them. And someone who is hyper aware of the rules is also going to be hyper aware of when you're doing things behind the DM screen that may not be exactly along whatever rule or campaign or pre-made that you're running. One way to deal with this is to empower the player to be the rules lawyer of the group, and set aside some time outside of the game session and say, listen, I noticed that you know the game really well. I noticed that you follow by the mechanics and that you're tracking stuff like this, and I want you to be a resource for us. So I might call on you to check a rule for us now and then. And sometimes what I'm doing might seem like it's smoke and mirrors behind the scenes, and that might be for storytelling purposes. But I want you to be a resource for this group, and we might call upon you to figure out what are the drunk rules, or what are the rules for exhaustion in the game that we're playing, or maybe we'll ask you to check on one or two spells, and put the agency in their hands so that they feel empowered, that they're being heard, and that the system that they're trying to play is working for both of you. In a way, you're saying, no, you can't be the dictator of how this game works, and no, you cannot interject while we're having a game session and kind of break things up and essentially challenge me as the GM, challenge my authority of what we're trying to create in this campaign. But you're also saying, but you do have a place here at this table. You do have agency at this table. Your voice is important and your opinion matters to what we're doing. And this is one example of how we can make that a reality for all of us here at the table. Now, one caveat to all of these things here and all of these suggestions and these two rules is that you might have something at your table that is just not working out. And that might just be a very human conversation that you need to have with a player, or with a number of players, or with your entire group, or with yourself, and say, is this player acting out? Is this player making things worse for the rest of the people at our group? Do we have something that is systemic that is not working in our group? Maybe I'm the issue. Maybe I'm trying to force a role-playing campaign on a party that just wants to do combat. The best service that you can do for your group is to step back and look at everything with a wide-angle lens and see, what kind of players do I have in my group? Maybe I don't need to define them as a power gamer or a storyteller or any other number of archetypes. But maybe I can look at that spectrum and see, what is my group looking to do? Maybe they're looking for a different setting and they want to play in a futuristic campaign rather than high fantasy. Maybe they're looking for something completely different and we should play a card game. Or maybe it's just one or two players that are acting up and I need to speak with them personally and figure out what's going on with them. Why are they not paying attention? Why are they not engaging in these game sessions? Or why are they trying to do something that's totally different than what I have in mind? And maybe it's me and I need to be better as a game master so that I can provide better content, or content that is more well suited for the group that I am GMing for. One great way to do this, and a pretty simple and easy way, is to create a Google form or like a Survey Monkey and send it to your players, have them fill it out anonymously, and make sure you get certain tick boxes like, what kind of game do you want to play? How much role playing do you want? How much combat do you want? What kind of setting interests you? How much do you like interacting with non-player characters? What's fun in this game? What's not fun? What are you enjoying most? Those kind of things. Send out a survey and you'll be surprised that you might find that everything is skewed towards one aspect of the game that you hadn't expected, or maybe everyone is really enjoying everything about your campaign and all you need to do is keep going and maybe just tinker here and there. Either way, I think you'll find the answer that you're looking for, and be sure to keep in the two concepts of player agency and player consequences, or the no but rule and the yes and rule, and I think you'll be in good shape. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Twitter for more crunchy content.